In this video, we are going to talk about CSS specificity. Now, this is an extremely important part of CSS and is something that a lot of web developers and those specializing in front-end development, when they don't understand it, run into a lot of bugs due to CSS specificity. So that means it is a subject matter that all front-end developers need to understand and understand well in order to make sure that they understand how their styles, as they cascade, are applied to the elements within their HTML documents. Now, the simplest or the clearest explanation of CSS specificity is, as we use CSS selectors, those selectors have different priority, or they have different strength to override and affect other styles inside of your HTML page that are provided by your style sheet. What this also means is that although we may have cascading style sheets where the cascade allows overriding styles based on the time that a style is loaded, what CSS specificity does is it also allows us to create rules or CSS selectors that are really strong compared to other selectors. And depending upon how they're loaded in the browser, you may find that you may have a selector rule that actually has more specificity than one that is loaded after it in the loading hierarchy, where you would naturally assume that the one loaded after has priority and would override just based on the cascading nature or the inheritance nature of CSS. The reality is the specificity also has a lot of weight in how CSS is applied to your HTML document. So the basic rules are, number one, the first or the lowest level of specificity, meaning the one that has the lowest priority in HTML, are type selectors. So type selectors are going to be selections using just HTML elements like an H1, a P tag, a div, or an A tag. All right? So that is the number one lowest priority. The number one lowest priority. That's a great way of saying it. So let's change this from number one, because a lot of people get confused when we use 1, 2, and 3 as 1 being the best. So let's just say lowest priority are type selectors. And our examples of type selectors are H1s, P tags, divs, all that kind of stuff. The medium priority, so let's say medium priority selectors, are going to be our class selectors. And if we remember when we learned about class selectors, we're talking about any selector inside of our style sheet that starts with a period. So period, main, nav might be an example, or period, bright, color might be one. It's pretty much anything that we decide has a dot in front of it, and we use the HTML class attribute on the HTML element that we are styling. So that would be our medium priority. Now our high priority element or selector is going to be ID selectors. And of course, that is going to be any CSS selector that begins with the the pound sign. So pound, we could do main nav again if it is a unique navigation element in our page, or pound header, maybe the header is unique. And if you remember when we talked about ID selectors, we try to avoid ID selectors at all cost, because ID selectors, number one, IDs are really meant for identifying or locating a unique HTML element in an HTML document, and it's primarily there, in my opinion, for when we are using JavaScript in order to get references to unique elements that we have dynamically added to our HTML. I rarely use ID selectors inside of my style sheets because I feel we're getting too specific in our styles. Our styles should be pretty generic and apply to multiple elements rather than only one specific element. So I tend to avoid ID selectors, but ID selectors do have the highest priority when we are talking about just regular generic CSS specificity. So keep that in mind as you are writing your styles. Anything with an H1 or just a regular type selector, a P, a div, or an A, or any of the other HTML elements, when we change that style, if we don't have a higher priority style set on it as well, these ones will take precedence. If we still have a selector for all H1s, and then we add a class selector to an element, the class selector will have higher priority over the type selector. And then even more so, the ID selector will have much more priority over the top of the medium and lowest priority selectors. So one really useful web page that a lot of people use in order to understand CSS selectors is one that I like to use, or that I've been to very often and that I refer students to, is this Stuff and No Nonsense blog. And if you just look up CSS Specificity Wars or CSS Specificity Star Wars, this gentleman here, Andy Clark, over the years, ever since 2005, that's how long I have gone to this website to get a reminder of how specificity works in CSS. So please visit his blog post and read about CSS specificity and how it works. The cool part about this blog post is that he uses a Star Wars analogy regarding Sith Lords and dark powers and how they can take over the CSS styles that we have and create bugs because we don't understand how specificity works. The really cool part is he has this nice little PDF cheat sheet that you can download and post on your wall next to your computer where you're developing, or keep it inside of your references folder in your dev folder on your computer, and pull it up whenever you're dealing with CSS and give yourself a refresh. And here he shows you how not only do those basic rules that we already went through apply, but you can compound the specificity by compounding those rules. In other words, when we looked at this right here, when we begin to mix and match all of these rules together, and we begin to implement a selector that uses both the lowest priority and the highest priority, does that rule then override the medium priority? And how does that work when we begin to actually create rules that might mix all three levels of priority? And how does this impact how our CSS is applied to our web page? And here you can see he gives you examples of just how powerful these combinations of low, medium, and high specificity based on the type of selector we're using actually receives its power. So here you can see regular HTML element has a one-time power. Using two element selectors, we've got double power. If we use a class selector, it's one-time power. If we mix an element selector and a class selector, we get 2 times power. And then as we mix these selectors and we become more and more specific, we begin to see the power that our selectors have in overriding and overpowering styles that might even be applied after our super specific style is applied. So go ahead and make sure you download, look at this, read through the blog post, and if you have any questions on CSS specificity, being that this was just an overview video, make sure you talk to your instructor or one of the tutors.